we're going to take a look now at how the British government is participating in the genocide in Gaza and also repressing activists and journalists who are exposing the state's complicity in the slaughter. Quite ironic topic for today, given the ban that we are facing on YouTube. And we're joined today by the journalist Matt Kennard. Matt is the co-founder and head of investigations at Declassified UK, a news website which focuses on British national security issues. He's the author of several books, including Irregular Army, which exposed neo-Nazis and other gangs recruited into the US Army, and most recently, Silent Coup, with Claire Provost, on how corporations have overthrown democracy. Matt was previously a journalist at the Financial Times before he effectively became a whistleblower on the global financial system and the networks of client journalism that sustain it, eventually writing the book The Racket, which looks at how the US empire rigs the global economy for the benefit of its elite. And in that book, Matt wrote about his time in the West Bank, an experience which, like for many of us, was a formative one. Since its launch in 2019, Declassified UK has published many articles focusing on Palestine, including reporting on Britain's Israel lobby and exposing the participation of British military and intelligence organizations in the genocide in Gaza. And we're going to talk more about that today. But first, let's welcome Matt to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thanks for having me.
It's good. It's great. No, we can hear you now. And
okay.
Matt, I've been following your work for a couple of years, so it's really nice to be able to speak to you now. And so let's get into it. Can you tell us more about the role that the UK has had and is currently playing in the genocide in Gaza, specifically in terms of intelligence and surveillance data for the Israeli army? And just before you get into that, you revealed at Declassified in May that the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force as it's called, had flown about 200 spy missions over Gaza since December. You wrote, quote, "All the British spy flights have taken off from RAF Akrotiri, the UK's sprawling airbase in Cyprus, and have been in the air for around 6 hours. Gaza sits around 30 minutes flight time from the base, so it is likely the RAF has gathered around 1,000 hours of surveillance footage over Gaza." How do you track these flights, and what do we know about their purpose?
Thanks, Ali. It's good to be here. I've been a big fan of Electronic Intifada for many years, so thanks for having me. So I'll start by the top line is Britain gets away, or people don't look at it so much because it's not a major contributor in terms of weapons. So it's dwarfed massively by the United States and Germany. But it's a key player in supporting the Israeli war machine through logistics and intelligence, as you mentioned. And this is all done mainly through this base on Cyprus, which is called RAF Akrotiri. Now, just a bit of background, Cyprus was made independent of Britain in 1960, or so the fable goes. But it actually wasn't made independent because what Britain did was retain 3% of the island and turned it into massive military and intelligence installations. And since the Gaza genocide has started, RAF Akrotiri, which is in the west of Cyprus, has become the major international hub for getting weapons, special forces and spies to Israel so they can participate in the genocide. And all this has been done in secret. So at Declassified, we're the only ones that have been reporting on this and revealing new information about it. And in fact, we've caused a big storm in Cyprus itself. There was a demonstration in Limassol, which is the second city in Cyprus, and it's right next to RAF Akrotiri. There was a massive demonstration there. There was a big demonstration actually at RAF Akrotiri, all based on the work we were doing. And none of it was covered in the mainstream media, and still hasn't. And this, I mean, as you guys will know through your work, that's not that surprising. But what surprised me about that was the president of Cyprus and the president of Northern Cyprus, because it became such an issue, had to make a comment, and it still didn't break into the mainstream media here. So what that means is they are complicit, because it shows that when journalism exposes the role that Britain is playing, and it's multifaceted, it's not just this, there is some pressure. If the mainstream media covered it in the same way that the Cypriot media covered our revelations, then there would be a pressure on the government to stop that access that they're providing to the US Air Force, to stop the spy flights, which are going up to 2 times a day. So Britain has got away with a lot of the complicity is not known about, because there's this focus on weapons, which is not the major part of Britain's role. And even recently, you know, there was great fanfare about the Labour government suspending 30 weapons licenses, but that was only 8% of the total weapons licenses that we provide them. Number one. Number two, it didn't involve anything we still supply the 15% of the parts for the F-35, which is one of the major planes which they're using to pummel Gaza. So it was all show. And in fact, even David Lammy in the Commons apologized profusely for doing it. He said, "I don't do this in anger.
He's the foreign minister.
He's the foreign minister, and he's very pro-Israel, and even though they did this suspension, his reaction was he was basically apologizing profusely to this genocidal government for doing it. And just a bit of context on that, how far the British political system has moved towards Israel is in 1982, there was a total arms embargo on Israel by Margaret Thatcher's government after the invasion of Lebanon. So no arms went. So this is tiny compared. And obviously, Margaret Thatcher was not a politician that I think any of us would have supported or would have thought was more radical on human rights than a Labour government. But anyway, so all this is happening in the dark. The other side of it is also GCHQ and MI6, because RAF Akrotiri is one part of these what are called sovereign base areas on Cyprus. There's another sovereign base area in the east of the island called Dekelia, which is a huge intelligence station, which is basically a US National Security Agency station as well. And they have a very, very close relationship with Israel, as we know. And it's very, very likely that intelligence being gathered from Gaza, which sits a 40-hour flight time from these places, is being shared with the Israelis. We don't know anything about that, because obviously these are completely secret agencies. And it's not secret to protect us; it's secret to protect themselves from us. And just to finish with the spy flights.
And Matt, just again to clarify for people watching all over the world, GCHQ, just tell us briefly what MI6 and GCHQ are, because not everyone will recognize those.
Yeah, so MI6 is the main external intelligence agency of Britain, and it's completely secret. GCHQ is the main surveillance intelligence agency, and actually GCHQ is much, much bigger than anything else in Britain. And they have huge amounts of power. They're basically a support team for the UK military. They don't present themselves like that. They present themselves with nice cuddly crosswords in The Guardian at Christmas time and stuff like that. But they are a major part of the British war machine, and obviously now the Israeli war machine. And it was revealed actually in the New York Times, which is this wasn't covered in one UK newspaper, but it was revealed in the New York Times recently, a couple of months ago, that Britain has had a spy squadron stationed inside Israel for the whole of the genocide, providing intelligence for them for what they claim is hostage rescue. But again, this is a very important point, because everything I've described that has come out, they've always defended it by saying it's all to do with hostage rescue. It's nothing to do with any kind of combat role. But Britain, David Cameron said in January, David Cameron was then Foreign Secretary, he said we have 2 hostages there. And now it's down to 1, because it's likely that the Israelis killed the other one. So you're talking about a 1,000-hour flight time, often 2 flights a day going from RAF Akrotiri over Gaza for 1 hostage. Plus, Israel has, as we know, has full control, surveillance of Gaza. It's unclear what Britain can provide. But what I think it is, these there are R1 shadows, they're called, these aircraft, and they can provide all sorts of reconnaissance information. One, is what's called target acquisition. And again, none of this footage is being released. My colleagues did another story recently, which was that there was a plane in the sky, a British plane, just in the sky over Gaza just before the assassination of the 3 British aid workers, which became controversial, but only for a few days. It was kind of,
and that was part of, they were part of the World Central Kitchen team.
Exactly. Yeah. And my colleagues requested the footage that was gathered by these British spy flights, and they were refused. So as you say, 1,000 hours, that was a couple of months ago as well. It's going to be much more now. This is probably the best information for one of history's worst crimes. So we need to get hold of it, and the ICC need to be demanding that that footage, because as I mentioned, like, Britain's role is basically a spy and logistics role. It hasn't been the Americans flying these spy flights every day, although they have been sending drones, but we don't know too much about that. In terms of official surveillance, it's the British, and they're refusing to hand it over. There was questions asked in Parliament about, will you hand it to the ICC? And they kind of didn't answer. They just said, well, we're not collecting any information that's not to do with hostage rescue, so there'll be nothing to hand to the ICC. But basically, they are complicit, and we need full exposure of what they were doing with that information, full exposure of what this spy squad was doing inside Israel and has been, and how involved in operations it's been. Because my hunch is it's been very involved. And let me just finish with this, because this is a very important part as well, which is the special forces role. As I mentioned, RAF criteria has been central to the international build-up of forces and equipment to get to Israel for its genocide. A major part of that has been special forces. Now, special forces are a completely secret part of the military. They're even more secret than the intelligence world. The SAS was reported by the Sun newspaper on October 27th as being deployed to Cyprus for Gaza operations, again, for hostage rescue. I don't believe that. On October 28th, the British Ministry of Defence, through its what's called a D-Notice committee, sent out a D-Notice. I'll explain what that is in a minute, but let me just finish. They sent out a D-Notice to every editor of the media and newspapers in Britain, saying, do not publish any more information about British Special Forces and Gaza. And they've acceded to that. We've had no more information. But what were those SAS doing in Cyprus? Were they moved to Israel? And we should come on to this, because there's been tons of cargo flights as well that have gone to Israel from RF.
Sure.
But the SAS, so the SAS are likely in Israel, and I have done work on the SAS before, and what is likely is that they will have an advisory role with the Israeli military about their ground invasion. But it's possible that they could be on the ground in Gaza, or could have been at certain points. There's no reason that that's preposterous. And in fact, Jeremy Corbyn did ask a question in Parliament saying, are there any UK personnel on the ground in Gaza? And they refused to answer. So again, we would get to the bottom of this very, very quickly if the media in Britain did its job, but it doesn't. None of this gets into the mainstream media. So it's multifaceted and it's out of the headlines. But I think if there's going to be any justice for the people that have committed this genocide, the British ministers involved and personnel on the ground should be high up the list of people that are targeted for justice by the ICC and the ICJ and any other body that's looking into these crimes.
Matt, can you talk about those cargo shipments, what you know about that, and a little bit more about this Akrotiri base and what it's been used for in the past, and whether there's been any, precedent for the kinds of intelligence and surveillance and weapons and parts, apparatus coming from the British government in such a secretive way.
Yeah, well, RAF Akrotiri is a major launch pad for all British wars in the Middle East. They bombed Iraq from there. They bombed Yemen recently from there 3 times, I think, during the recent US-British attacks on Yemen. And I've actually been there. I was there in 2022 for a bunch of stories, one of which is up on the screen. Now, what's interesting about RAF Akrotiri, and it goes to this whole theme of like the empire is really exposed now because they've had to come out of the shadows for the Gaza genocide to really expose themselves. One thing about British bases is that they are basically American bases as well. And this is one of the major services that the British do for the Americans after the imperial handover, after the Second World War. They kept themselves relevant by basically retaining these sites around the world, which includes Falklands, Gibraltar, Cyprus, Bahrain, Nepal. That we have bases everywhere, and they're basically all American bases. And the irony is, you can get information, and I've tried and got information about UK activity on these bases, but you can't get any information about foreign military activities, which is primarily Israeli and US. They basically say a blanket statement of, we do not comment on foreign allies' activity on our bases. So the US we know the US has been moving weapons to Israel via RAF Akrotiri, but the UK government has stonewalled any questions in Parliament from MPs or journalists as well. So there's that, and then so all the information I'm describing is basically being got by us, but through the Ministry of Defence has had to react. So you mentioned the cargo flights. Now, I noticed on flight tracker websites soon after October 7th that Britain was sending basically a cargo flight every day to Israel from RAF Akrotiri, and these were all C-17s and A400s, which are huge military transport vehicles. They can carry huge amounts of weapons, including tanks and helicopters, and up to 150 personnel in terms of the C-17. And again, not covered at all by the media. So I asked the Ministry of Defence, I said, how many flights have you sent? I guess this was at the end of October, and they said, we're not going to tell you. But then I independently did it and did a story on it, and reactively they then said, okay, well, we sent this many. And then it carried on and on and on, and we still don't know what had been on those flights. By June, there was a flurry of it up to about January, and then it kind of settled down a bit. But I did a story in May, and the total was 60, but about 48 of those were in the first 3 months. And they always said, the British said, when they had to defend it, which they haven't because the media's not asked them, when I've asked them, they've always said, well, it's about moving ministers to and from Israel, and it's about moving medical supplies. But you're sort of like, why would you need 48 massive C-17s and A400s just to send medical supplies? So we don't know what were on those. And again, it's about complicity in genocide. They know, I think my hunch is that the British ministers, when they were doing it, they knew that what they were doing was illegal or could make them vulnerable to prosecution, because at one stage, an MP in Britain, who everyone should know, he's not an MP anymore, he lost his seat at the last election, but he's called Kenny McCaskill, and he was an MP for Alba, which is a sort of splinter off from the SNP, it's a Scottish Nationalist Party. But he led the way in Parliament in trying to prize information, and he asked a parliamentary question, which is a system here where you can any MP can ask government departments for information. He asked a question about RAF Akrotiri soon after we started publishing these stories, and they said, we're blocking it. So the British government actually blocked. They didn't even answer the question and say we can't answer because of national security reasons. They said we're not going to answer any questions about RAF Akrotiri. So there's a cover-up, and we need to get to the bottom. And can I just mention one more thing? I know I'm rattling on, but there's one more important part of this, which is also about Israeli planes in the UK, because I found I asked how many Israeli planes had landed in the UK after October 7th, military planes, and the Ministry of Defence said we don't comment. And then I independently verified that 6 had landed at various locations and gone on to Nevatim base in Beersheba in Israel, and also into the US, Dover, which is a base where a lot of the weapons for Israel are coming from. Anyway, after that, they, again, same dynamic, they changed course because they realized, okay, we've been got here. So they announced in, I think, February that 9 Israeli military planes had landed. And then a couple of months later, Kenny McCaskill again asked how many Israeli planes have landed. This was after the ICJ investigation had started. And they said, they reversed their previous position and said, we're not going to tell you how many Israeli military planes have landed now. So you see again and again, there's a cover-up, a massive cover-up, and it will come out eventually. But my belief is that the cover-up has been ordered by ministers who are scared because they know they are complicit in a genocide, which is being investigated by the ICJ, and obviously as well the ICC have requested arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant.
Matt, there's so many questions I have for you. I mean, well, I'm just going to ask my questions before I forget them, and then you can take them in any order you want to. But one is, I want to ask you how you do this, because there are flight tracker websites and apps that I like to use, and I know I have the experience sometimes that there's a plane flying overhead. Literally, I can see it, but then I look at the flight tracker app and there's nothing there. It's not on the app. So my question is, how do you track? I mean, without giving away any secrets, how do you track these flights? Why are they making them visible? That's one question. I'm just going to ask the others because I know I'll forget them otherwise. The other is there any evidence of, now this base is, as you said, Akrotiri, about 30 minutes flight time from Israel. Is there any evidence of Israel operating out of the base or any indication? And the reason I ask that is because you may remember recently, a few weeks ago, the speech by the Hezbollah leader, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, who indicated in his speech that Hezbollah had indications or evidence that Israel was moving aircraft to Cyprus to protect them from potential strikes by Hezbollah, Iran, or anyone else. So was he possibly referring to Akrotiri or other British and or American controlled bases on Cyprus? And my third question is, well, okay, so we have these British ministers who were afraid that potentially this is your thesis. Of course, you know, all of this is shrouded in mystery, but it's a reasonable hypothesis that they're covering up these activities because they're afraid of being held criminally accountable. But there's recently been a change of government in the UK. When the genocide started, you had a Conservative government. Now you have a Labour government. Can we expect, or is there any change with the change of government in the UK?
Yeah, I'll deal with them. I'll deal with the last one first and go backwards.
I'm sorry again for throwing all that at you at once.
That's all right. That's all right. I'll try and remember. You can nudge me.
Now I'll remember. Having said them, I'll remember them.
Labour government. No, I don't think there's any hope of. In fact, as you guys have done nearly all the important work on the power of the Israeli state over the Labour Party, it's complete, and in fact, in many ways, even more complete than the Conservative Party, I believe. I think that what was happening, again, it goes to the point about the vulnerable to criminal prosecution, because I think that the Labour ministers were told by people in the Foreign Office, look, we've got legal advice that what we're doing is illegal. If you don't do anything, you will be vulnerable to prosecution, because there's no way David Lammy and Keir Starmer wanted to do that. And it was a token gesture as well, as I mentioned. So they're not going to make any change, and they've done nothing to change the much bigger British role, which is the ones I've described. So it's window dressing, and but again, it's quite interesting because the Israel lobby and the Labour Party, they feel like they have such complete control over it. Even that symbolic gesture has put them on the wrong side of them. You know, there was a massive outpouring of attacks from all the usual suspects when they did that, even though it was a token gesture. So it is interesting. And the only reason they did it, as I said, because there was a resignation by a Foreign Office official, the first resignation of a British official, despite the deep complicity, about a month ago. So no, I don't expect any change. And actually, if you look at the spy flights and other parts that I've described, they still happen. They're still going on, and there's the same secrecy. So, and then on your second question was about Israel itself using RAF Akrotiri. Now, that's a very good question. And yes, there is evidence. So about maybe 3 months ago, the Daily Express, which is one of the worst newspapers in the world, they they had a briefing from an anonymous British official who said the British have rescinded access for Israeli F-35s to land at Akrotiri. So the imputation was they previously had access. And as I said, that we provide, the UK supplies 15% of the F-35, and they provide aftercare and maintenance for the vehicles. So my hunch is that they were landing at RF Akrotiri for that aftercare and maintenance. And we don't know, we have no idea what, another question was put down in Parliament about that. And they said, we refuse to say if Israeli military planes have landed at RF Akrotiri, as for the reason I said before, because we don't comment on foreign militaries' activities on our bases. But again, we need to know that, because my hunch is the complicity is much, much deeper than we know, and involves direct Israeli planes, because as I mentioned, we allowed them to land in Britain, 9 of them that we know about, and they've stopped divulging how many more. And it's very likely those planes were carrying weapons. So, and the UK, my colleague John McAvoy did a story recently that UK airspace has been used to transport, we know this for a fact, to transport huge amounts of weapons to Israel. So yes, I think that the Israelis have definitely been used in British bases, and very likely have been using RF Akrotiri, according to this Daily Express article. But we don't know. And again, sorry to bang on about this, but it's one of my bugbears. If the mainstream media had done anything about it, it would have really put pressure on the government to stop that access, because after I revealed that about those Israeli military planes in Britain, the Scottish government rescinded access to for the Israeli military to Glasgow Prestwick Airport, which was where an Israeli military jet had landed in November. That was under the SNP government there. So imagine if, and that was done without any mainstream. That was done just from an article on Declassified. If there were articles in the Guardian and the Telegraph really were exposing this complicity, not only would it stop, but there would be pressure to prosecute the ministers responsible, which there should be. And then your first question was, it was related to that.
It was about how
do you get these? How do you get the information? Yes.
Yes.
So it's interesting. So the Israeli military planes in Britain one was hard, because the flight tracker website I use, which is called Radarbox, they have, the Israeli Air Force is on the blocked list. You can't get any information. But I remember just one day I was messing around, like looking at different ways I could get information about Israeli Air Force movements without actually going through that one portal. And I found a way of doing it. It was basically a heat map where it's, for some reason, they'd put where Israeli military planes were on a heat map and listed some bases. So I looked, and one of them was Glasgow Prestwick. There was another one called RF Mildenhall, which is a US military base in Britain. And then, yeah, published. It was an incomplete article because I could only find 6. It was actually 9 that the government divulged after my article. But that was one way of doing it. I mean, the other stuff has been mainly, just going down the list and counting how many flights are going, because they do list them. Which again, you asked the question of why do they put the information up there, and I do wonder that as well. But it is also incomplete. Even the stuff there, I know I'm not getting the right numbers, because it might be way more. There was an article early on in the genocide in Haaretz, which said RF Akrotiri is the international hub for the international support for Israel's attack on Gaza, and they quoted, this was about a month in, that 40 different US Air Force transport planes had landed there, and that was way more than I could find on Radarbox, and I couldn't work out what the discrepancy was. I don't know how they got that other information, but it's not complete. But it's, as I say, the dynamic is we publish an article which reveals an incomplete sort of picture, and then the government is exposed and they feel they have to release the real figures. But as I say, we don't know what one, with the cargo flights, we don't know what was on them, and we need to know. And number 2, on the spy flights, we don't know how this information is being used. So we're kind of still scratching the surface. And this is going to be years and years of work, and hopefully will end with prosecution of the ministers involved, because all journalists should not down tools when this horror finishes. We need to, it's our job to make sure everyone who had anything to do with it is held accountable.
Yeah.
Matt, very quickly, what about the people in Cyprus? Who you said there's 3% of the island that is that has been stolen by the British military for this base. What has been the reaction to the to all of this by people in Cyprus who are watching this happen, who are watching these transport planes carrying weapons or surveillance equipment or whatever it is inside that is aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza? What have the people in Cyprus been saying?
Well, it's been huge. You know, I didn't know this before, but there's a huge pro-Palestine movement in Cyprus. And I've been contacted by countless people sending me videos of actions of protests that have been using our work. And they're all saying, thank you so much, because our media is not covering it. So, there's been some coverage in a paper called the Cyprus Mail. But actually, it's quite interesting. If you look into the major, the sort of papers of record in Cyprus, they're quite aligned with the British military. And in fact, one of them actually published a hit piece on Declassified, which was a real hatchet job. This is like the paper of record in Cyprus. It was sourced to some anonymous British military official, but it said something along the lines of Declassified UK is known to be aligned with the Labour Party in Britain, which I found very funny, actually, because anyone who has spent any time on Declassified or on my Twitter account knows that's quite far from the truth. But there's been a huge outpouring of disgust. And I think it's really been a massive problem. The British ambassador, they had to release a statement. It's a high commissioner, actually, in Cyprus. They had to release a statement saying we had nothing to do with the genocide in Gaza. The representative in northern Cyprus had to give an interview to a newspaper where he defended what the British were doing. So we've really caused a lot of problems for the British there, which is right, because they should be held accountable for facilitating this genocide in such a direct way and also covering it up. And just to go to the question of how do they feel about the British military and intelligence bases. Now, it was quite interesting. In 1960, Archbishop Makarios, he was like the liberation leader of Cyprus. He was the first president of democratic independent Cyprus. And he was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement. So Cyprus wanted to be non-aligned from the east and the west. But one of the stories I actually did in 2022 when I went there was I found top secret declassified documents that showed that the British had secretly turned Cyprus through these areas into a NATO asset and actually housed nuclear-capable Vulcan bombers on these sites. So the British have been taking the piss with Cyprus ever since we supposedly left. But they're not super unpopular there because, number one, everyone hates the Turkish occupation much more because Turkey invaded in 1974 and has never left. And the occupation of northern Cyprus is not recognised by any one country in the world apart from Turkey, which has a reason to recognise it. So and also if you go to the border, like the Turkish have put massive Turkish flags all over the hills. So it's clear that there's an occupation. Whereas the really interesting thing about the British zones are, because this 3% is not just military bases. There's military bases on them, but you're talking about huge parts of Cyprus, but there's not a single British flag. It's quite interesting. And I was talking to people when I was there. I was like, why is it that I was interviewing people on the sovereign base areas and saying, do you know you're on sovereign British territory here? This is like locals and tourists. And they said, you must be joking. We're in Cyprus. I was like, no, you're on British territory. So the British try and keep it really, really low level, usually, because they don't want to attract the ire that there is for the occupation in the north. But that's been completely blown out of the water by Gaza, because as I say, there's this huge pro-Palestinian movement there, and there's huge disgust that their land is being used as the international hub for facilitating, supporting, and arming this genocide.
Matt, I want to ask you, I want to come back to Yemen, because today, according to Yemeni media and non-Western media, British and American warplanes have been bombing Yemen for the third consecutive day. And I was looking for more information on this, and I could find literally no information in Western media, none. It all came from Yemeni media or media in the region. The only sort of Western confirmation, at least of the American role, was a tweet from CENTCOM, the American Central Command, which confirmed American attacks on Yemen. But I could find absolutely nothing related to the British role in these attacks on Yemen, which, according to Yemeni media, yesterday killed 2 people and injured 5 others at a girls' school near Taiz. So talk more about that. Why is there this media silence? Is that, you referred earlier to these D notices. Could that have something to do with it? Or is it just that nobody in the West cares about Yemen? And then talk more about the British role and the role of these bases in the war against Yemen, which until Gaza, you know, it's a horrible statistic, but until this genocide in Gaza was the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe because of the US-led war on Yemen that started by Barack Obama in 2015. Talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question, my sense is it's not the notices or anything, which makes it much, much worse. It's just that our media, and this has been exposed more than I think ever in that I've seen in my lifetime, but probably before, by Gaza, is just our media is just operates 99% of the time as just an arm of the state. They report exactly what they're told, or they report exactly what the media, what the government says. So when basically something that's not conducive to the state narrative just doesn't exist. If the British government comes out and advertises the fact it's bombed Yemen, then the media will report it. But if they haven't, I haven't looked into it because I've been away in the last couple of days. But that will be why. D-notices generally are about special forces and intelligence. In fact, we got sent one once, and they told us to censor one of our articles about Paul Biya, who's the oldest dictator in Africa. He's the dictator of Cameroon, and we did a whole investigation, my colleague Phil Miller, about British support for him, and they contacted us and told us to censor something, and we told them no. But Yemen, yeah. So Yemen is again is a British crime. Not only the destruction and bombing that you've seen recently because of its solidarity with the Palestinians, but before that, in the war that started in 2015 that you mentioned, the British role was huge, and may even have been bigger than the United States. We armed I think 60% of our arms go to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi dictatorship particularly is a British thing. You know, we helped install them in the 1930s, and we have since the 60s had 12 troops embedded in what's called the White Army, which is like the personal protection force of the Saud dictatorship. So and again, none of it was reported. In fact, before Gaza, nearly all the work we did, a large portion of the work we did at Declassified was about the British role in Yemen, and none of it was reported in the mainstream media. And in fact, there was a very brave UK soldier that protested outside the Ministry of Defence, I think probably like 4 years ago, and he had this thing where he rang a bell to every minute to signify how many Yemenis were dying because of the British war. And he was arrested by military police outside the Ministry of Defence in London, discharged. firstly his protest and his action was barely covered by the British media. Then we interviewed him at Declassified UK, and he said, actually, I learned about the British role in Yemen from Declassified UK. Now it's absurd. At that point, it was 3 of us. It's absurd that we are complicit in, as you say, the worst at the time, which was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. 2.3 million kids on the brink of starvation. Just the Saudi military bombing schools, hospitals, prisons, everything. It was completely barbaric, and yet no one was covering what was going on. It got to, and it was direct. You know, we had 5. I don't know if they're still there, but during the air campaign by Saudi Arabia, we had 5 UK military officials inside the Saudi Air Operations Center, inside, who would have seen every single war crime that was committed by the Saudis. There's never been that's not even been mentioned in the media, let alone interviewing maybe some of the people who saw this stuff. So British complicity is deep, and it is quite interesting because, as you mentioned at the start, my books before Declassified UK were always focused on the United States because it's the most powerful country in the world. What it does has this huge impact. I'd always thought Britain was a bit of a bit player that doesn't have a big, but we're deeply involved in all the worst stuff that's happening around the world, and we get away with it because people think we're not a big player anymore. But our effect criteria is a sign that we are, and also we're willing to do things that other countries aren't because we want to prove ourselves that we still have the sort of imperial muscle. Why the United States doesn't need us to help them bomb Yemen, does it? It doesn't need us, but it's to show, okay, we're an alliance. The Israelis don't need us to fly R1 Shadows over Gaza. This is one of the most sophisticated militaries in history. Why do they need British to fly? It's just so we're used as a kind of cover to create the sense that there's coalitions for these terrorist regimes, and as shown by the Gaza genocide better than ever, the British establishment have absolutely no scruples about massacring thousands of people, thousands of kids, about their client, one of their closest allies, withdrawing all food, water, and electricity. So it's a really ugly story, the British, and it goes back to the empire. You know, there's this whole idea that the empire died after the Second World War. Firstly, it didn't; it just repackaged itself. And secondly, the mentality that gave the British establishment, which is fostered in all the private schools in Britain, like Eton and Harrow and others, that mentality is still deep within the British establishment. And what it is a deeply racist, deeply colonial mentality that actually doesn't see people like Palestinians as human beings. That is the bottom line of it all. And that runs deep in British society. And I actually think Britain's maybe one of the worst countries in the world for that, and that's shown by the fact we've had no whistleblowers. Still, 11 months in, there's so many different agencies that are involved in this genocide from the British side, and we've had no whistleblowers. In the United States, there's been quite a few, and there's been a steady stream of people resigning from, and I think that's because the deference to authority, the deference to this imperial program is much deeper in Britain and goes much further back historically.
Yeah, it's and meanwhile, the British government is also waging this incredible war of repression against activists, journalists like yourself and your colleagues. Of course, we spoke a little bit last week. Asa brought up the story of Sarah Wilkinson, an activist who was arrested with a swarm of police. They, as part of her bail conditions, which were eventually reversed, she wasn't allowed to use a phone or any digital device. And this is just for posting on Twitter. And this is happening to multiple journalists and activists around the UK. Can you talk about the atmosphere of repression by the British government for of people who are trying to hold the government accountable and expose the kinds of war crimes that the government is involved in?
Yeah, well, I'll start by this. That this isn't new in Britain. We don't have a culture of adherence to free speech or free press that I think you kind of do in the States. Obviously, I'm not praising the mainstream media in the US, but there's a different culture. Denotice committee is one example, right? If I talk to American journalist friends, it's like, even the establishment ones, they're like, what you have this relationship with the intelligence and military in a formal way where they tell you what you can and can't publish. Like, we do it, but it's behind closed doors. It's a bit embarrassing. But the UK, the Denotice committee is seen as fine, and that tells you what you need to know. And in terms of us, a year into founding Declassified UK, because of our work on Yemen, we were blacklisted by the Ministry of Defence. And it became a big problem for them because the Council of Europe issued a level 2 media alert, which meant that the military had to respond. And eventually they had to appoint an independent inquiry in Parliament, which resulted in a very, very shocking report about what was happening internally and why they blacklisted us. And then the Defence Secretary at the time, Ben Wallace, had to get up in Parliament and apologise to us. He said, "We apologise to Declassified UK." So that's the history. We've never had, our government has never believed in free press, or although they use it as a soft power, a way to project power around the world, they never believed it internally. Another example is Julian Assange, right? But this latest attack on Gaza, journalists and activists involved in anti-genocide politics here. I mean, well, I'm not in England at the moment, but in England, is shocking. Especially, it's not just Sarah Wilkinson. What they did to Sarah Wilkinson is absolutely outrageous. Now, she is like a very prominent journalist and activist, just posting regular updates on what's happening in Gaza and exposing the complicity of her government. And they've raided her house, 13 police officers, some in balaclavas, and like tipped over the urn with her mum's ashes on, which she had to like get off the wall, bundled her into a van, and then released her with these bail conditions where she couldn't use a phone or even touch a phone. And that came a week after Richard Medhurst, who's another independent journalist, was stopped at Heathrow and detained under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, which is a hugely serious thing. It carries up to 14 years in prison if you're convicted. And he was held in solitary confinement for basically 20 hours, given a 1-hour interview. And they didn't need to do it like this, but what they wanted to do was to send a sign that it is not tolerated to speak out for Palestinians in Britain anymore, because they have lost control of the narrative in Britain. It's important to get this across. Zionism is dying in Britain because people have seen too much. They've had 11 months of watching this horror, and they do not believe all the lies. They're not playing the game that the Zionist lobby wants them to play anymore. And the establishment, which is in lockstep with the Israelis, is scared by that. And in fact, I think being guided in some senses by the Israel lobby, because the other thing is who were reporting these people to police. There was after Sarah Wilkinson was arrested, there was a tweet sent by this account called Nasher Jew, which is a account which just tries to smear anyone who is pro-Palestinian as an anti-Semite. And they tweeted something along the lines of, "At last, the police have taken up our repeated references to Sarah Wilkinson's extremism, blah, blah, blah." So that's a sign that there's Zionist groups, and this is a hunch, a reasonable speculation, are reporting people, are trawling the internet and reporting people who are saying things that they want to use to get them arrested. So and Starmer, it has happened. It's ramped up under Starmer, which is not surprising if you look at his history, because he was head of the CPS. He was senior public prosecutor in Britain from 2008 to 2013, and he has an awful record in that regard. During the 2011 riots in Britain, he put people away for like years for stealing a bottle of water in Tottenham and other places. So it's actually a scary environment. And I'm doing this interview on my phone. because I didn't want to. I'm going to Germany for a story, and I didn't want to take my laptop because I don't know what's going to happen on the way back in. They want to send a message that you cannot do journalism, you cannot expose us on Gaza. And no one, I mean, everyone, it should make everyone double down and go harder, but and it's not going to work. But that is the message they want to send, and that was also the message they want to send by putting Julian Assange in Belmarsh. I'll just finish with this. I've never not taken my laptop on a reporting trip, and I've been to Myanmar, I've been to Palestine, I've been to plenty of other places. I never even thought about it. This is the first time I've thought, I don't want the police to take my computer, and I didn't even bring a dictaphone. So it is scary. But then, not to sound corny, but when you compare it to what the people in Palestine are going through, it's nothing. So it's that there is a sense, I think it's probably all of us feel like that there's a bravery you get from watching their resilience and watching, like you were talking about, the educational, the schools that are doing the buying a bag for their kids. Like these are amazing people that are resisting some of the darkest forces in history. And we have a degree of freedom. It's receding, but we do have a degree of freedom. So if we're not using that to expose our complicity in this horror, then we're not doing our job right, and we're not being moral individuals. So it's not a difficult choice to take, and it's not yet at a stage where people are being put away for years on end. Although, if I was Sarah Wilkinson or Richard Medhurst, I would be worried, because anyone should be worried if they're charged under an act that carries 14 years in prison. Because we saw with Julian Assange in Britain that they do not care about how they appear publicly. They do not care that that there's this example, there's this man sitting in Belmarsh maximum security prison for exposing war crimes. They did it, and most of the way they got away with it is because the media never covered it and they never problematized it. I'm serious. When he was in Belmarsh, I talked to people that don't know about politics or aren't that interested, and they'd be like, "What? He's still there?" Like, the media allowed it to happen, that we had a political prisoner and a journalist, and no one knew about it. And I'll finish with this. That's happened with Richard Medhurst and Sarah Wilkinson. They were arrested maybe a fortnight and 3 weeks ago. This is really, really serious, unprecedented. The Guardian has not published a single word about their arrests. The Guardian has not, obviously the rest of the media has.
And of course, without going, deep into those details, the Guardian played a very nefarious role in the political imprisonment of Julian Assange, and also printed a lot of lies during his imprisonment and mocked him during his imprisonment. So it's not just that they're silent; they're sometimes actively egging it on, and it's extraordinary to me to hear that you felt you couldn't bring your laptop because of the risk that that Keir Starmer's police will detain you when you re-enter the UK and demand perhaps that you hand it over or give them whatever information. But the one thing I sort of smiled when you were talking, I said, well, at least you're allowed into Germany, because I actually got banned from Germany.
Yeah, well,
Nobody's perfect.
I was surprised. Yeah, I'm obviously doing something wrong that they let me in, but and as you say, the Guardian, they were a major part of the information war against Julian Assange. That is a whole different story, but it does relate to Gaza as well, because a lot of the stories I've been doing on Akrotiri have been referencing the WikiLeaks cables, because, as I say, these are hugely secretive installations, and the only way we got information. So, for example, one of the cables, US cables, included a British letter from an official saying the US is now flying routine spy flights from Akrotiri, and they were worried about, and that information is being passed to third-party governments, likely Israel. I did a whole story about it if anyone wants to look it up. But the attack on Assange is the same as the attack on the Gaza journalists, and it's the same on, and it all goes to Gaza as well, because they do not want they don't want the imperial system to be exposed, because Israel is a small country, it's 9 million people, about the same population as London. It's got a GDP smaller than Sweden. It couldn't survive for a week without the support of the Anglo-American empire, particularly the Americans. And that's what they want to obscure. And that's how they always do these, like, oh, we don't know. Yeah, that was bad. It was nothing to do with us. They are complicit, deeply complicit, and actually participants, because they make it possible. And Julian Assange exposed all that. He exposed the system, but he also exposed the British establishment and the British justice system. But I'll have to come back on another time to talk about all that.
Yeah. We absolutely will have to have you back. And just before we let you go, Matt, I want to say that yes, we can't compare. You know, none of us who are sitting here can compare ourselves to the situation of anyone in Gaza, especially journalists who are targeted and murdered systematically. At the same time, our friends, our loved ones, our colleagues in Gaza tell us how important it is that we continue speaking out. And so no matter what repression we face, we have to continue doing it, and we certainly will. And the work you're doing is absolutely essential. And just from talking to you, I've learned so much. And so we would love to have you back again soon. And I'm just going to remind people before we let you go that you are the co-founder and head of investigations at Declassified UK, which is an absolutely essential independent publication. So I really recommend that people go to Declassified UK. They can follow you on social media, on Twitter. You are at Matt Kennard, is that it?
Kennard Matt.
Kennard Matt. But certainly they should look for Declassified UK. You're also the author of some really important books, including Irregular Army, Silent Coup, and The Racket. And we're very, very grateful for your time today. Good luck with your reporting mission in Germany, and we wish you a safe return to Keir Starmer's Britain.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll say as well that I've been admiring Electronic Intifada's work for many years, but particularly since the genocide started. I think you guys you're the most important English language outlet in the world at the moment. So keep going, and you've got amazing contributors. Particularly someone I've started following recently that's brilliant is who you mentioned. His dad made that artwork for you, Abu Bakr. Incredible. Yes. Yeah, he's so inspirational. You know, he tweeted the other day his quote that he said to you guys, I think, about, look, if I can smile, you can at least smile. I was like, yeah, okay, that's true. If he's teaching us that, then we should listen. But thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt.
So much,
we'll
Matt.
see you again soon.